Welcome to the ECE Classroom Podcast with your host, Susie Beghin, inspiring early childhood educators every day. Welcome to the ECE Classroom, the podcast where we dive deep into the world of early childhood education, parenting tips, and creative learning strategies. I'm your host, Susie Beghin, and today I'm flying solo. I'm going to be building on what I talked about in the last episode. It's August, and as educators, it's time to get ready for a new school year. September is just around the corner, and this is usually a time when educators spend a lot of time planning for the school year, getting their classrooms ready, planning out their activities, maybe planning months ahead of time, weeks ahead of time, or even a whole year ahead of time. You know, when I first started as an educator many years ago, we used to plan on a monthly basis, and we used to use themes. Each week was a different theme, and they were usually the same every year. They would repeat. In September, we talk about apples and leaves, maybe community helpers, maybe all about me. And then in October, we go into transportation and Thanksgiving and Halloween. And every month, we have weekly themes that relate to that time of year. We would search Pinterest, we'd print activities, and we'd prepare our classrooms and get ready to teach on these subject or interest areas, we called them. We think about what we're going to teach and what the kids should be learning from that. But then a few years ago, something changed. We decided at my daycare centers that we wanted to have a more emergent curriculum, which would be based on children's interest. So something had to change. The themes were not going to cut it. You know, when you want to plan on children's interests, I've learned that there's a different question that we need to ask. Instead of asking, what should I teach this month? What if we asked, what are the children already trying to learn? And how can I support that interest? That one question completely changed the way we look at curriculum planning. Because when we really watch children, we begin to realize that they're already showing us what they're curious about. We don't need to fill them with information, and we don't need to tell them what they need to learn. They're already investigating. They're already experimenting. They're like little scientists, always conducting experiments, learning about their world. Our job isn't always to decide what comes next. Sometimes our job is simply to notice. A few years back, I remember setting up what I thought was the perfect activity for the children. You know the kind. Beautiful materials, everything carefully arranged. I thought about what I wanted the children to learn from it. I'd taken the time to prepare everything perfectly. It looked amazing. I was excited about it. But you know, the children walked over to the activity, they looked at it, and then they walked away. And instead, what they did was, for the next hour, they carried baskets of toys around into different areas of the classroom. They filled them up, they carried them, they emptied them out, and then they went back and did the same thing all over again. And I'm standing there thinking, but what about my activity? Why didn't they engage? And that was a big learning lesson for me. They weren't interested in my activity or my plan. They already had one of their own, and it was better. And when I stopped thinking about the activity that I wanted them to do and started paying attention to what they were actually doing, I saw something completely different. Those children weren't just carrying toys around. They were investigating. They were figuring out how much they could put in their basket, how they can fit it all in. They were experimenting with weight. Could they carry it? Was it too heavy? They were navigating space. They were making decisions. They were solving problems. And they were even working together. And most importantly, they were engaged in the learning. We talk a lot in early childhood education about following children's interests. And I absolutely believe in that. My whole curriculum is based on that. We know that when we plan around children's interests, the learning increases, the engagement increases, because we're connecting learning to something that already matters to them. But there's another layer that I think is incredibly powerful. Instead of only noticing what children are interested in, like the objects, we can start paying attention to how they're exploring whatever it is they're exploring. Not just the materials, but the actions on what are they doing with those materials. And what are they repeating? What is happening over and over again? Maybe they're constantly moving objects, like in my example. Maybe they're lining things up. Maybe they're building things and connecting things and then knocking them down. Maybe they're putting objects into containers and emptying them out. Maybe they're fascinated with things that spin, roll, or move. And I know that sometimes these behaviors can even drive us a little crazy. We start thinking, why are they dumping all those toys out again we just cleaned up? Or why do they keep moving those things from one area to another? But what if instead of seeing these behaviors as something we need to redirect, we started seeing them as clues? Because those repeated patterns can tell us something about how children learn. This is where schemas come in. In the last podcast episode, I introduced the concept of schemas. If you don't know what I'm talking about, I highly recommend you check out the July episode where I introduced the concept of schemas. Schemas are basically repeated patterns of behavior that children use to explore ideas and make sense of their world. And once you start seeing schemas, it's almost impossible to stop seeing them. Suddenly, the child who keeps moving things around the room isn't trying to make a mess. They're transporting. The child who keeps throwing things isn't misbehaving. They might be fascinated with the trajectory schema. That happens when things move through space. The child lining up cars might be exploring positioning. And that's where the planning starts to change. When we plan around the repeated ways that children naturally explore and investigate, something powerful happens. Children tend to stay engaged longer because they're building on something they already motivated to explore. Learning becomes deeper because they have opportunities to test their ideas in different ways. And there's another benefit that I think educators will appreciate. Planning can actually become easier. Instead of thinking, okay, what am I going to do with them this week or next month? You have a starting point. The children have already given it to you. So here's how it works. You observe the child. You notice the patterns, those repeated patterns are what we call schemas, and then you think, how can I support and extend this? That's a very different way of planning. It's responsive rather than prescriptive. You're not trying to pull children into your lesson plan. You're stepping into their learning that's already happening. And that is powerful, and not to mention effective. So this is exactly why I've become so passionate about schema-based learning and why I created a new resource. It's called Learning Through Schemas, and I've just released them. They're now available. Over the years, I've collected countless observations, activities, and ideas that intentionally build on the way children naturally learn. Schema-based learning isn't really something new. At my childcare centers, Alpha's Discovery Kids, we've been using this schema-based learning approach for several years now. And we've seen firsthand how well it really works. I've taken what I've learned over the last few years in observing children, observing schemas and planning experiences, and trying out all kinds of different activities, and really seeing what truly engages them. And I compiled all those ideas and activities into practical resources to help other educators use schema-based learning and bring it into their own classrooms. Because I know how challenging and time-consuming planning can be. We as educators are so busy. We don't always have hours to search Pinterest or scroll through Instagram to come up with another activity from scratch. And sometimes we find a beautiful activity online, we recreate it, and the children just aren't interested. Because the activity might look great, but it isn't connected to what those particular children are trying to learn and what they're interested in. So once you start recognizing these patterns, these schemas in children's play, Planning becomes less about searching Pinterest for the next cute idea and more about responding to the children right in front of you. And that's the shift that I want more educators to experience. It's so incredibly powerful. So I created these resources to help educators move from simply recognizing a schema to actually knowing what to do about it. You might be thinking, okay, I see what the child is doing. I see the schema, but how do I support it? How do I even plan for it? Noticing the schema is the first step. The next step is figuring out how to intentionally extend and support that learning. That's where the resources come in, and that's what they're designed to help you do. So I want to tell you a little bit about these resources. I've created a collection called the Schema Activity Bundles, and they connect children's natural play patterns into meaningful learning experiences across many different areas of development and curriculum. There are resources for literacy, science, technology, engineering, art, math, physical activity, and so much more. So for example, if you notice a child repeatedly transporting materials around the classroom, you can identify that as the transporting schema, and then choose an activity that builds on that natural drive to transport. In the literacy area, in the STEAM area, physical activity, or any other area of learning. Or maybe you're seeing children fascinated with things that roll, fly, or move through the air. Instead of constantly saying, please stop throwing that, you might recognize that as the trajectory schema and provide an appropriate experience that allows them to safely investigate that same concept in a purposeful way that eventually leads them to different types of learning. The concept behind the schema activity bundles isn't just a bunch of activities that you can throw onto your project plan. It's not about saying, what activity should I do today? It's actually the opposite. You start with the child. You observe the play, notice the schema, and then choose an experience that supports that schema and what they're already trying to learn. That's the piece that I'm really excited about, because it takes us away from simply choosing activities because they're cute, seasonal, or look good on Pinterest. Instead, we're making intentional choices around curriculum based on what we're actually observing in children's play. And I've done a lot of the planning work for you to make this much easier. The resources give you the activity ideas, the materials you need, and exactly what to do. So you're not starting from scratch every week. I've also created something called a schema play guide that introduces the 10 most common schemas and helps you understand what each one can look like and what you might notice in children's play so that you can support it. So if schemas are completely new to you, I would start with the Schema Play Guide, which is a free resource available to you. And if you already understand schemas, but you're looking for practical ways to use them in your curriculum planning and support and extend that learning, the activity bundles can help you take that next step. You'll find all my Learning Through Play schemas resources using the link in the comments to this episode. My hope is that these resources don't just give you more activities. I want them to help you look at children's play differently. Because once you understand why children are repeating certain behaviors, you can become more intentional about what you offer them next. So as September approaches, here's something I'd encourage you to try. Before you decorate every corner of your classroom, before you print all your lesson plans, before you decide on your September theme, spend some time simply watching. Observe, listen, take notes. What do the children repeat? What materials do they return to again and again? Are they carrying? Are they connecting? Lining things up? Ask yourself, what might this child be trying to figure out? Then, instead of deciding what you want them to learn next, think about how you can build on that learning that's already happening. And if you need some help figuring out what to offer next, that's exactly why I've created the Learning Through Schemas resources, to help you do just that. So the planning process can be really easy. You observe the schema, understand what the child is exploring, Then choose an experience that intentionally supports and extends that learning. Because children are already telling us what they need. They're showing us through their actions, through their play, and through those repeated play patterns called schemas. We just have to learn how to see it. And once we do, planning becomes less about finding something for children to do and much more about discovering where their learning can go next. I hope you enjoyed this episode of the ECE Classroom. I sincerely wish you a wonderful September and an amazing school year. Thanks for tuning in to the ECE Classroom with Susie Beghin. For more information, you can visit our website at www.susiebeghin.com. Remember to rate, review, and subscribe to our podcast so you can stay up to date on our latest episodes. Thanks for listening.